Kevork Almassian is a political analyst from Syria who predicted years ago that U.S. support for terror groups like al-Nusra Front would lead to the replacement of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad with violent extremist groups, even though he was proven correct. As he objected to that war, he was swiftly punished. He was deported from Germany, which had granted him amnesty as a Syrian refugee. Because he expressed the supposedly wrong opinions about Syria, the German government made a special exception to their refugee laws in order to expel him from the country for his heresy against the CIA NATO regime change narratives. We talk about what happened to Syria since Jolani's takeover, who's responsible, and why so few human rights organizations seem to care at all. The United States this past week removed former Al Qaeda terrorist and current president of Syria, Abu Muhammad al Jolani, from the list of foreign terrorists. This comes 7 months after Jolani and his militias overthrew the Assad government, something which was celebrated across the West as a victory for democracy. And I'm sure that there's some in Syria who feel that way. Many do not, especially Alawites who fear for their safety because of ongoing massacres perpetrated by what are now the Syrian government's own militias that are loyal to President Jolani. I want to talk later about how we got to this point to discuss the 14-year-long so-called Syrian civil war. But what was your initial reaction to the decision by Western governments like the United States and UK to remove the terrorist designation for Jolani and to recognize his government of former Al Qaeda terrorists?
Personally, I wasn't surprised at all. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't surprised because I followed the Syrian war from its inception in 2011, and I have read the leaked documents of American officials and how they saw and perceived the Syrian war. I would just give you examples. In 2012, the American Defense Intelligence Agency, they have prepared a report and their evaluation about the conflict in the country, which in 2012, it was already a hot war. It was an insurgency, and there were multiple sides fighting against the Syrian government or the former Syrian government. And the evaluation of the American Defense Intelligence Agency was that the driving force behind the insurgency against Assad are the Muslim Brotherhood, Takfiri jihadists, and the Al-Qaeda in Iraq groups. Knowing this information, Barack Obama put his signature on the CIA covert operation in Syria called Timber Sycamore in order to arm and train these radical groups in Syria. Now, it was a covert operation. It was secret because in parallel, they had a public training program belonged to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon said we're arming the moderate rebels. So they needed another parallel program, a covert, a secret one, which they could and would supply the weapons and the ammunition and the training to the more radical groups in the country. So because of this support of the US military support, which came through two military operation rooms in Turkey and in Jordan, in Turkey it was called MOM and in Turkey called MOK. Those military operation rooms consisted of the Saudis, Qataris, the Turks, Jordanians, and the Americans and the Brits. So they have funneled all these weapons into the country, and it ended up mostly in the hands of this Al-Nusra Front. Al-Nusra Front is a franchise of Al-Qaeda led by Jolani. Jolani later was called as a potential ally of the United States by none other than Jake Sullivan, because Jake Sullivan sent an email to his former boss, Hillary Clinton, saying basically, quote, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Later in 2014, 2015, when Jolani's army occupied the borders between Syria and the occupied Golan Heights, which is now under the occupation of Israel, the Israeli forces have not fired one single bullet against the Jolani army. In the contrary, they have carried out hundreds of airstrikes against the Syrian army positions, but zero against the Jolani army. On the same side, the Israelis also received these Al-Qaeda forces into the Golan Heights field hospitals, gave them the medical treatment, logistic supports, and light weapons and cash money. And those are the words of the UN. Those are the words of the Israeli press. I'm not bringing any analysis or personal analysis on this side. So we have these 2012 two secret documents. We have Jolani occupying the borders with the Golan Heights and receiving Israeli support. And then in 2021, when the US started rebranding Al-Qaeda into what is called HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, because they needed to present him as a civilized person who could lead Syria into democracy, the former special envoy of Syria, or US special envoy to Syria, his name was James Jeffrey, under both the Democrats and the Republicans, he said, I'm also quoting him, that Jolani's army is an asset for the US strategy in Syria. So taking all this into consideration and seeing how the regime change war ended and unfolded into Jolani coming into power, all these indications lead us to believe that the US, despite its designation of Jolani as a terrorist, or his organization as terrorist organization, but he has received tangible and consistent and continuous support, not only from the United States, but also its allies in the region, namely Qatar. Qatar was the biggest donor and financial supporter of the Jolani's army. Then comes Turkey. Saudis were not supporting Jolani much because they had other proxy groups such as Jaish al-Islam, Islam's army, Ahrar al-Sham. So the Qataris and the Americans and the Turks played an instrumental role in bringing Jolani to power. Now that he came to power, they cannot normalize him. They cannot endorse him or accept him as a legitimate government unless they remove this bounty over his head and then also lift the sanctions against him. Now, the most important information that your respected audience should know is that people think that Jolani came to power and afterwards he accepted to the American diktats, and that's not the case. Jolani, before he came to power in October 2024, he already accepted the American diktats. Because I think this was on the 10th or the 20th of October 2024, the Jordanian foreign minister came to Damascus, Ayman al-Safadi, and he brought a list of demands from the Americans saying, look, the Americans and the Israelis have killed Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, and he was your very close friend and an ally, and this could be an opportunity for you to, do your historic shift and join the moderate Arab camp. And what is the moderate Arab camp? It's the Jordan, Saudi Arabia, UAE, the Arabic countries which normalize ties with Israel, whether tacitly or publicly, and they are revolving under the umbrella of the US foreign policy goals in the region. So Assad rejected this offer from the American and the Israeli side. And only 3 weeks later, Jolani attacked on Aleppo. So those are not coincidences at all. This is very important because they would not have greenlit Jolani to attack Aleppo and then advance to Damascus unless they were sure, and he has already signed on accepted the American diktats, and those are: one, normalize ties with Israel and end any sort of support to Palestinian resistance groups or Lebanese resistance groups, close their offices in Syria, kick them out of the country, and seal the borders with Hezbollah, which Jolani done all of them. Beside this, now this is very important because under the Assad rule, the Palestinians were equal as Syrians. So they could have received free medical health care and free education, and they were treated as Syrians in the country. Now Jolani revoked this status from them, and they are no longer called Syrian Palestinians, they are rather called Palestinian residents, which means they no longer considered equals to the Syrians. And this is also one of the important aspects, because Israel wants to block the way for any future call for the Palestinians to return to their home countries, because they are trying to kick out more Palestinians from Palestine, especially from Gaza, and Jolani is cooperating in this case. Finally, Hezbollah is a very, very important case for both Jolani and Israel, and they found a mutual enemy in this. And yesterday, Jolani, on Sunday, I believe he was in Baku and met with Aliyev, and there he met also with Israeli security officials, and they're coordinating to see if they can wage a joint attack against Lebanon, and namely against Hezbollah, in the coming weeks. And that's why we have now lots of discussion and turmoil inside Lebanon itself. People are fearful of Jolani Al-Qaeda army basically attacking against Lebanon. So I'm not surprised. This is my reaction is like, yeah, they were on the same boat and they have succeeded in this regime change operation. And now they have crowned the person who basically acted as an asset for the American strategy in the region.
There have been massacres of Alawites across the country right now, and they're ongoing since this former Al-Qaeda terrorist Jolani seized power in December. And Reuters actually published a very good investigation on this at the end of June, and it revealed that Jolani and his new HTS government in Syria were just behind this string of pogroms against Alawites in March that killed over 1,500 people. I've seen estimates as high as 1,700. If you remember, there was an explosion of reports that were written by human rights organizations about Syria in 2011 about government repression and the abuses of the security state. But for some reason, these human rights organizations have been largely silent about these massacres, which really anyone can see. They're on Telegram and Twitter, and the scenes are posted routinely. Actually, this past week, Amnesty International did call for an investigation into those massacres, but most human rights organizations haven't really said much at all. What do you think explains the near silence of these Western human rights organizations, media, and governments toward these atrocities perpetrated by this new Syrian government? And what does it really reveal about those institutions?
First of all, I have to say that I have read this investigation of Reuters, and it's brilliant that they have shed light on these crimes. However, the reasoning behind these massacres, which were claimed by Reuters, is also false. They always try to attribute the Alawites to the Assad regime, like as if the Alawites were loyalists, the only loyalists to the Assad regime, and that's completely and factually incorrect. The biggest loyalists to the Assad regime were the people who had money among the Sunni circles. They are the ones who had the money in Aleppo and in Damascus, business circles and the industrial circles, right? And nobody comes and says nowadays that Assad had support or loyalists from the Sunnis. It's only pointed at the Alawites in order to justify this type of, they call revenge acts, right? And those are not revenge acts because, look, for 800, 900, 1,000 years, the Alawites have been persecuted by the Umayyads, by the Ottomans, by many Orthodox Sunni powers in the region. And back then, there were no Assad, or neither Hafez nor Bashar. And that's why the Alawites ran to the mountains in Syria, in Skandaron, or the Hatay region nowadays, and in different regions in the Levant, where there are hills and mountains, because they wanted to protect themselves against the organized persecution by the existing authority back then. And so historically, the Alawites were persecuted in the region. This is nothing new. Now, attributing them to the Assad regime, in my opinion, is dishonest by Reuters itself, because the reason is ideological. People need to go a little bit back into history and see who are the scholars who came and interpreted the Islamic teachings again, or revolutionized the Islamic teachings, and said clearly that the Alawites are apostates, they are infidels, and we have to purify our Islamic home first from the Shiites, from the Alawites, from the Druze, from the Ismailis, from the other small minority sects, before we wage a war against the others, and the others are the Christians and the Jews. Therefore, when you see the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah, it's quite clear that the first focus is on the Islamic minorities, and then they would come after the other religions. So this is, if somebody don't know about these teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah, they will not understand why Jolani unleashed these attacks against the Druze, against the Alawites, and against the Shiites in the country. And while we are speaking now, still pogroms and attacks going on against the Alawites and also against the Druze in As-Suwaida governorate. That being said, I think these human rights organizations, of course, they have done relentless work to document any possible war crimes done by the Assad government. Now, what happens with these human rights organizations is the following. They document war crimes or any crimes committed by a regime that is unfriendly to the United States, right? And what happens is the United States can use these documents and these investigations as a justification to intervene, impose sanctions, and even military intervention in different places around the world. Now, let's suppose these same human rights organizations, without naming any of them, they have published, let's say, an investigation about the crimes of the Jolani regime. So they have published an investigation about any crime committed by the Assad regime, and they have published, let's say, investigation committed by the Jolani regime. But which one of them can be instrumentalized and used to further geopolitical interests in the region, the ones that are against Assad, right? That's why all these human rights organizations, which whether they talk about these human rights abuses or not, they're irrelevant, because what is relevant is which power can use these reports and investigations to impose new realities in the region, and that is the United States and Israel, right? So the US can use these human rights reports to impose its rule or dominance over the region, unlike other powers who are always come as a victim of these human rights organizations. So I always see them, or I take their conclusions with grain of salt, because personally I have my personal experience with them. Like 10 years ago, I was 26 years old, 25 years old. I was more, let's say, an activist type of a person. And then you grow up more and more, you become a different person, right? But when I see 10 years ago, investigators who work for Amnesty International basically doing political activism on social media platforms for regime change in Syria, you start questioning their intentions and whether or not they are going to publish a credible, let's say, investigation. One example of it is they published a report about the Saydnaya prison. I believe this was in 2017. And if you go to the footnotes and if you go to the methodology of the research, basically, they are mostly based on eyewitnesses and testimonies from unknown and unnamed people whom they refuse to reveal for security reasons, although they say that they are already out of Syria. So if you build an entire investigation about Syria based on supposed eyewitnesses and testimonies of people that you don't know who they are, you don't know if they were even let's say, in this prison, then you start asking questions about the organization itself. You remember Human Rights Watch, the former head of the Human Rights Watch, his name was, I forgot his name, but Kenneth he was Ross. Obsessed. Yes, Kenneth Ross. He was obsessed with Syria. And you would really ask the question why a person like him was so obsessed with Syria and selling this narrative that the human rights abuses in Syria were so dramatic and so brutal that it requires foreign intervention. So they have manufactured the consent for intervention in the country, not to improve the human rights situation, because as you mentioned, now pogroms are happening, killings are happening, and massacres are happening against civilians in the country. So human rights situation didn't improve, but what has changed is the geopolitical reality, and that's what these human rights organizations helped achieve in favor of the US and Israel, basically, in the region. Those are the two powers which benefited the most from this regime change operation. Israel, US, Turkey are the biggest benefactors, and the biggest losers are, of course, Iran and Russia.
Yeah, and Jeffrey Sachs had a great quote recently about exactly this phenomenon that you're talking about. An activist confronted him about his views on Syria, and they asked him about, well, what about the agency of the Syrian people? And he said, well, he's not talking about agency, he's talking about the opposite, that this was a war. Wars cost money, and that it's really naive to believe that the clandestine state isn't directing the show.
I am not discussing the agency of the Syrian people. I'm discussing the opposite. Do not be naive. Do not think that 600,000 people died because of Assad and the protesters. This was a war. Wars are expensive. They require billions of dollars. They require armaments. And I'm not talking about a conspiracy theory. I'm talking about a conspiracy. And you should know. Everybody go look up Operation Timber Sycamore. Understand what happened in your region. And if you think that calling in the CIA is going to do the bidding of agency in this region, you are sadly mistaken. This region has been manipulated by Britain, France, and the United States for 100 years since the Versailles Treaty. It will not have safety or peace until the United States is out of this region through manipulation and war. You all say, well, it's Israel doing this. It's the same thing I'm talking about. It's the same reason for Operation Timber Sycamore. It's not an independent fact. It's the reason why this happened. I'm the last to denigrate agency. I'm telling you exactly the opposite.
There was this 2013 highly classified assessment that was put together by the DIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff that forecasts exactly this, that the fall of the Assad regime would lead to chaos and that potentially to, Syria's takeover by these extremists, exactly what was happening in Libya at the time. And that assessment turned out to be exactly correct. And in many ways, as we've discussed, it was the American deep state, along with their allies, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, that really helped to produce this outcome. The former ambassador to Syria, the hawkish Robert Ford, even said in a recent speech that, he collaborated with MI6 to rebrand Jolani and make him more palatable to Western audiences.
Starting in 2023, a British non-government organization which specializes in conflict resolution invited me to help them bring this guy out of the terrorist world and into regular politics. And at first, I have to tell you, I was very leery of going. I sort of had images of me in an orange jumpsuit with a knife to my throat.
So the U.S. and clandestine or deep state, whatever you want to call it, role in this regime change effort has really been known. It's been known also since at least 2014-15. The New York Times was writing about Operation Timber Sycamore. People like Aaron Mattei and Seymour Hersh were writing about the same thing, and they were labeled Assad apologists. So who are some of the people then that are really responsible for what's unfolding today? And do you think that any of those people will be held accountable at all?
First of all, I want to say something about this interaction between Jeffrey Sachs and the other person. So the other person didn't really reveal his true affiliation, right? He just came as a spontaneous journalist and activist who suddenly they have given him the microphone. No, this guy was planted there because this was the Antalya Diplomatic Forum. And he works for a Qatari outlet. And Turkey is a strategic ally of Qatar. So he was there to ask that question to Jeffrey Sachs with hoping that he could embarrass Jeffrey Sachs. But Jeffrey Sachs handled the situation quite well. So it's very dishonest, to put someone in the audience and claim that, he wants to ask a question to Jeffrey Sachs. No, he was planted there to ask that question hoping that he could embarrass him. Anyways, I think the biggest factor why Assad regime was destabilized and removed from power is Israel. There is no other consideration. Because Syria didn't pose a security threat against the United States. Syria cooperated with the United States against Al-Qaeda after 9/11. Even
with the extraordinary rendition program, Syria was one of our biggest clients. We sent people. We did not have a problem at all with their torture in 2005, 2006. We were using it.
Exactly. And in 2004, I believe, Al-Qaeda elements tried to blow up the American embassy in Damascus, and the Syrian security forces foiled that attack. And Condoleezza Rice came and thanked Syria for their cooperation and foiling this attack against the American embassy. So the problem between Syria and the United States was about Israel. Syria saw Israel as an illegitimate political entity. They have negotiated and talked to Israel to normalize for the Golan Heights and to accept Israel as a fact in the region, but without having an embassy in Damascus. So there were so many talks between Israel and Syria in the past, but all led into a dead end. Syria never accepted to sign a peace treaty or normalized relations at the end of the day. And Syria was offered multiple times a deal. It was offered one when Assad, the son, came to power, multiple times. The last one was in 2008. The last time was under the mediation of Erdogan, because Erdogan and Turkey were trying to persuade Syria to leave the axis of resistance and join the moderate Arab camp and normalize ties with Israel and open its territory for the Qatari gas. You know, there were so many investments in the region that could have happened. And Assad rejected these deals, and there are multiple reasons why he rejected them, right? Some of which are for geopolitical reasons, some of which are for legitimacy, because the Assad rule itself, it has imposed its legitimacy as being a pan-Arabist government. And the pan-Arabist government aspires naturally the liberation of Palestine. And they have supported consistently different Palestinian and Lebanese armed groups against Israel. So the Israelis were very interested in striking a deal with Syria. The last one was under Ehud, the former prime minister of Israel in 2008. I'm sometimes forgetting the names. I will remember his name anyways. So he was talking to Assad through the mediator, which is Turkey. Now, when Syria rejected the deal offered by Israel in 2007, 2008, the Americans decided to knock him out quickly for Assad. But the French back then, Sarkozy, they told the Americans, we have to give Assad another chance. And this chance was represented in 2008 French National Day celebration in Paris, when Sarkozy invited Assad to Paris and rolled him a red carpet, sent him all the media outlets to give him the impression that he's an important person and on the international stage. And once all the leaders were on the stage, if you remember this video from Euronews, you can show your respected audience later. It's called like a Mickey Mouse, Assad and Olmert. Basically, Ban Ki-moon, the French foreign minister, the Hamad bin Jassim, everyone on stage, they were physically trying to push Assad to shake hands with Ehud Olmert. What was his name? Was it Ehud Olmert? Yes, I think his name was Ehud Olmert.
Yeah.
So they were pushing him to shake hands, and Assad turned his back and he walked and he stood by himself. And this is the same year, the former French foreign minister, he was on France 24, and he said in 2008, he was invited by his British colleagues, and they offered him to be part of a regime change operation that is going to happen soon in Syria, and he rejected it. So all these sequences of events lead us to believe that it was this deal that they wanted to strike with Syria to end the Palestine question once and for all. That was the reason why they wanted to remove Assad from power. And now we have lots of piling evidence after Assad left, and how the new regime opened up all of a sudden all its markets and all its diplomatic corridors to the Israelis, to the Americans. They have already normalized ties with Israel. They have already given up on the Golan Heights, because now in the official state media outlets, they call the Golan Heights Israeli territory. And they speak about Israel as an Israeli state. Under the previous regime, they used to call it a Zionist entity. So I think this is the main reason why they wanted to knock Assad out. And Turkey collaborated, Israel, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, lots of powers in the region. Of course, MI6 and CIA, they were really instrumental in this. And none of them will be held accountable, because the victors, they're the ones write history. And you see with your objective eyes, they are rewriting history in front of our eyes. It's like, imagine, like, we're still alive and we have witnessed this war and we lived it. Like, I lived the war. I went through it and I know what happened. And they're just changing the history in front of our, like, to your face. So I have no hope at all, because I don't believe there is a rules-based international order or justice. See what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, mass murdering Palestinians, waiting for food and medication and water, and who is holding them accountable? No one. So how can we even expect them to be held accountable when we can't even hold them accountable for a mass murdering civilians, basically, in Palestine, right? So I'm completely hopeless, to be honest with you. Some could see it as an pessimism. I see it as realism, because once you do zoom out and see international system from the point of view that only power and strength rules, and it's the only thing that matters in international system. The rest are all cliches and smoke screens to distract the people and even convince them to go against their own interests. So you mentioned that there are people in Syria celebrating. If I told you the truth, right, and told you now you are the slave and they will enslave you and you will own nothing and you will be happy and they will take over your Golan Heights and you will forever be a client state for the US and Israel, you will not celebrate it. But if they sell it to you as a liberation, people are in the streets celebrating their own demise, right? And people come to my X account and they call me an Assadist, and they say I'm an Assad lover. I have no bread with Assad. I have not gained anything from Assad. But in the contrary, I lost a lot from my reputation, from my money, from my health, because I loved my country and I wanted to be patriotic and show the people what's happening. That was the only motivation. But unfortunately, they have won. So we have to at least try to continue telling the people that what the US is doing now in the region, again, a new Sykes-Picot, basically redrawing the maps and as if it's their own property, it just shows that we're living in a place which is worse than a jungle, you know, like, because in a jungle, there are rules and animals respect, even their respect among the animals, and they don't eat each other for fun. They don't kill each other because somebody was born in the wrong religion. But what's happening in Syria is worse than a jungle nowadays.
Right. You just like, anyone who objected to the CIA-backed regime change war that killed over 500,000 people in Syria was called an Assad agent or an apologist or puppet. The same way that, anyone who opposed the NATO-led regime change war in Libya that spiraled the country into chaos to the point where they now have slave markets and no government at all was called, pro-Gaddafi. Anyone who objected to the Ukraine proxy war, which you could see a mile away, was going to produce misery and destroy that country, was called, Russian or Putin apologist. It happened to me. And it's just a shame that propaganda and those labels work so effectively, and that it takes till the end when, people like Jolani, these, Al-Qaeda operatives gain power, that it's too late to see what was clear from the start. So I
would
really
just say one thing.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing, Harry. This is important because you mentioned 500,000 people died, right? So if you follow now Al Jazeera or any media outlet which supports Jolani, they will continue telling you that 1 million Syrians died, and they will tell you 1 million Sunnis were killed by the Assad regime. So this sectarian rhetoric and this false information that they are trying to normalize in the minds of the people in order to justify the current massacres against the Alawites. And I will say the people the following. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights was one of the biggest opponents of Assad, right? And they have documented the death toll in Syria. And the death toll is above 500,000, okay? And above 500,000, 1/3 of them are Syrian army soldiers. And 1/3 of them are the so-called Free Syrian Army, Nusra, ISIS, and the rest of the shades and forms of these insurgent groups. So you have two-thirds of this casualty rate are militants from both sides. And the 1/3, the unfortunate 1/3, which is a huge number, by the way, over 130,000 civilians were perished in Syria. They died in all the geography of the country, in areas controlled by the government and in areas controlled by the opposition groups, which means both sides killed civilians. And in this case, you can't come and say 1 million civilians died and you question what's the source of this? How do you come to this conclusion? And why do you say they're all Sunnis? It's crazy, but they're manufacturing consent for these massacres against the Alawites and the other minorities in the country.
Yeah, I mean, the propaganda around this war is really unlike anything I've ever seen, to the point where people even deny the U.S. role in intervening at all. I mean, there's people like Ann Applebaum who write articles back in 2016 with titles like "Our Disastrous Non-Intervention," saying that Assad is personally responsible for killing 500,000 people and that Obama did not intervene at all. When it was clear, I mean, at the time and forever, that we've been intervening through rat lines, through Libya, and also through this Timber Sycamore program, training these jihadists, with Turkey.
Tom Barak, the special envoy to Syria, who is the ambassador of the US in Ankara, 2 days ago, he said, United States doesn't do regime change. We don't like doing regime change because it doesn't work. It's like, and he says, we didn't have a dog in this race. It's like, imagine the audacity coming and saying the United States had no role in Syria. It was the US which initiated this war in Syria. They have engineered this regime change operation in the country. But as we talked, they are the victors, so they're the ones who can say whatever they want. But the job of the journalist, what is the job of the journalist? You're sitting in front of Tom Barak and listening to him, and it's like you're moving your head. That's the job of a journalist, or the job of the journalist to challenge what this official says. So we don't even have serious journalists nowadays sitting in front of officials asking them the correct questions or challenging their narratives, because the journalists have become part of the establishment. And the establishment nowadays punishes or gives you the medals, prizes, fame, money, if you're a good and loyal journalist. I mean, I don't like to speak personally, but if I was on the mainstream side, I would have made lots of money. I would have made a great career. My friends and my colleagues who we studied together, they apparently they're much more smarter than me. It seems that they're doing so well. They're receiving prizes. There are books being written about them because they're so smart, only because they're anti-Assad, right? This was the only criteria. If you're on the right side of the American narrative, then you will be rewarded. So there is an incentive also for many people to become not a good journalist, because if you embarrass an official like Tom Barak, you will never ever have the chance again to interview someone like him. So better behave and act. Otherwise, you become a conspiracy theorist, like we are smeared as conspiracy theorists, Assadis. But believe me, those words have no meaning any longer, because if you accept them and feel that you are being targeted by these words, then it is impactful. But once you don't you really have not to care about these words, because what they're trying to do is to silence you. Like calling you a right-wing, a fascist, an Assadist, and this and that. Those are all labels. And they do that only because if they had the argument, they don't need these labels. They can just prove that you're a liar. But they can't prove you're a liar. They will say, oh, he's an Assadist. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I really think that those heavy-handed tactics and those really dishonest and disingenuous tactics too of launching those labels, they no longer work. And I'm thinking specifically of, the Israel issue. For the longest time, anyone who objected to Israel's repression, decades long, of the Palestinians was labeled an anti-Semite. And that really chilled and cooled off a lot of the criticism that country got. But, the floodgates are open now on really all of these issues, all American wars, the war in Iran. You can talk critically about the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan the way you really couldn't 10 years ago. And so those labels, they really mean nothing, which I think is some progress, even if the situation itself is getting worse. In all those regards, I think at least it's a lot more open to talk about it. So I really do appreciate you being here. It means a lot, and it's just great to get your insight on all these topics. You are a rare voice that is unfortunately, not put on corporate media enough. And so I hope that you come back.
I was hosted a few times by corporate media, BBC, Deutsche Welle, and others, but TRT, the Turkish one, but they would host you one time. And then they would notice, no, this guy, because they like to host people from the other side, but they host someone who doesn't have the serious argument. They are really picky. They have interview producers. So what they do basically, they host someone from the other side, but they host two others against him, and this person doesn't have the best skills, let's say, to argue against them. So they try to portray this person as a stupid, you know. It's all dishonest, and they do it on purpose, you know. That's why they hosted me once, and then they would never host me again, because to be honest with you, I can speak forever about this Syrian conflict, and I can bring facts after facts after facts, but the other side is just, you know, you feel like it's this old cassette that is repeating itself. Assad sent tanks and killing his own people and gas his own people. Nobody is buying this stuff any longer.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. And you know, the corporate media just gotten so dishonest. I mean, it's always been, but especially in the past, you know, 5, 10 years, that just being disinvited from any of those shows or not invited back is really more of a badge of honor than anything else. So really, thank you for being here today. I appreciate it.
Good pleasure. Thank you.